All right, last time we were looking at the solar system and the various things with the planets and how the planets show a young universe and not an old as the evolutionary narrative is. And I skipped on purpose. I skipped the Earth, and I want to come back to that, look at the Earth and Moon a little bit in this discussion, and kind of delve into some things we want to look at related to the geologic column that maybe I should have had in that flood section, because a lot of the flood stuff kind of overlaps, but we'll get into some of that as we go as well, and hope that y'all can see. I forgot to move that chair this morning. All right, so the Earth, when we study the Earth, it is uniquely designed for life. Scientists have been sending, NASA's been sending these probes throughout space, throughout the solar system over the last several decades in search of life. They're frantically searching for life to try to prove evolution, that life could happen in other places. There is no place in the universe like our Earth. Life-giving water, which, according to the evolutionary model, where did it come from? Shouldn't be there, is there. 70% of the planet is covered with water. Can't have life without water. Earth's rotation is slowing down, I'm told, 1/1000th of a second every day. Not enough for us to ever notice that is going on, but they say the rotation is getting a little bit slower. Leap seconds are added every year or two. So they have to add a second to the year every so often. Billions of years ago, if that were the case, the rotation would have been really fast. You would have had things like the Coriolis effect, the conservation of angular momentum, which would again be going ridiculously fast for life to exist. The sun has over 99% of the mass of the solar system, but only 2% of the angular momentum. Our sun spins very slowly. The planets move very rapidly around the sun, and this pattern is directly opposite to the pattern predicted. So all the things that are rotating, it is not as you would expect to do if it had been a big explosion. It is not at all what it would have been. If Earth is slowing down, would have been spinning very, very fast several billions of years ago. Too fast for life, and some have speculated that, again, scientists always want to talk about uniformitarianism, that things always been the same. If that's been the case, and there's been billions of years, some say, well, the winds would have been blowing 5,000 miles per hour. It's a pretty stiff breeze, I would say. Our rotation is perfect today. If it were too slow, you would have extreme temperature changes. If it were too fast, you'd have very violent winds. Our tilt gives us moderate seasons. We talked about the tilts of the Earth before. Our circular orbit gives us climate stability. So all of that is perfect the way that the Earth is formed. We have plenty of water here, and water is necessary for life. And according to evolutionary models, there shouldn't be water here, or at least not as much as what we have and what you and I enjoy. You think about the things with the rotation of the Earth and the revolution of the Earth. It goes back to Genesis 1:14, I think it is, where it talks about the creation on the fourth day of all these heavenly bodies. And God says for signs and for seasons and for this sort of thing. And that's what we see. The day is our rotation, so it gives us the days in our calendar. The month, the Earth-Moon relationship, and a year, our distance around the sun. And again, all that is perfect for us. And we think about our one satellite, the moon. There's a number of planets that have multiple satellites. We have just one satellite here. When the Apollo projects reached the moon in 1969 through 1972, one of the things they did a lot of experiments, but they put these reflectors there on the moon's surface where they could shoot beams to the moon and come back and kind of measure the exact distance between the two bodies. And so over the last 50 years, they've been measuring this distance. And so here's some locations of some of these reflectors that they put on the surface of the moon. And of course, there's one of the astronauts putting up the American flag on the surface of the moon. Great accomplishment. So some things about the moon. The moon is close enough so that its gravity creates tides in our oceans that prevent the water from becoming stagnant. so keeps the water fresh. If it were closer, the resulting tides could be disastrous. It is exactly the right distance. Again, these reflectors were placed on the moon, as we said. The exact distance, they say, from the Earth to the moon is 238,885 miles. The moon is presently, however, what they have found is the moon is moving away from the Earth about 1.6 inches per year. Not of a big concern to you and I. Over 6,000 years of biblical history, that wouldn't amount to very much, a few feet over that period of time. The inverse square law states the force of attraction between two objects is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. So what does that mean? That means, for example, if something were moved 4 times closer, the attraction would be 6 times stronger. Whereas it would be like 4 squared is 16, or 3 times 3 is 9, is what that's saying there. Using this formula, the moon would have been touching the Earth 1.2 billion years ago. Whereas if that rate had been constant, if the solar system, if the Earth-Moon system is 4.6 billion years, that doesn't add up mathematically. It can't be the case. A closer moon would have been catastrophic tides if the Earth were millions of years old, even. In 6,000 years, the moon would have moved about 800 feet further from us. Again, that's not a big deal in the history of the planet if it moved 8,000 feet. Or 800 feet, I mean. Not even a mile. Much shorter than a mile. It would take 39,600 years to move 1 mile. The Earth cannot be billions of years old because the Earth and Moon would have been touching, wouldn't they? There is evidence of volcanic activity on the moon, which was kind of a surprise to scientists. Again, the billions of years scenario, you would think the moon, like some of the other places we talked about in the solar system, would have become dead at this point. It appears to still be geologically active. There's Myria and transient lunar phenomenon. It is geologically active. Something this small should have cooled off a long time ago. It's supposed to be old, cold, and dead. It is not. Eclipses involving the sun and the moon, and Brother Wayne was mentioning this to me after class the other day, and it is an interesting thing to think about. Eclipses involving the sun and moon happen occasionally, as we know. Every great while you have an eclipse of the sun. I think we had one in 2017. I had to tell our kids, don't look up at that, where that's going on. The chances of their size matching exactly are very low, and in fact, we find that the moon is 1/400th the size of the sun. All right, so it's, the sun is 400 times greater than the size of the moon. However, the sun's distance is 400 times the distance from the moon, making its apparent size the same. And Brother Wayne brought that up to me in class. Whereas as you would look at it in the sky, they're the same size to our eyes, yet the sun is 400 times bigger, and yet the distance is 400 times more as well, making its size look identical. The chances of that happening by chance are infinitesimally small. You would think it was designed if you didn't know better. But God had designed it that way. Is the only moon in the solar system with the dimensions cause eclipses. That does not exist anywhere else in the solar system. So again, our moon is uniquely designed for us. Again, a fascinating thing to me. All right, so again, the moon is receding at about 4 centimeters, 1.5, 1.6 inches per year is what they measure as they try to shoot these beams back and forth and measure the distance it takes to come back.
I wonder how many years they've been capable of measuring that distance.
Well, that's a good question. I think, again, I don't know that I can answer that exactly. I think before the moon projects, they had an idea of how it was. I heard, in fact, I played a speech from my world history class the other day where President Kennedy was giving a speech in 1962 where he first proposed we want to send a man to the moon and bring him back in this decade and all that. And he used the term 240,000 miles, which is about what it is. So I think they knew about what it was. I don't think they could measure that exactly until about the last 50 years or so, putting those reflectors there. They might.
Ham operators, amateur radio operators and stuff like that for years have been doing an Earth-Moon bounce with their ham radios. So
Okay.
they'll shoot a signal that's actually bounced off the moon, and said they might shoot it from here and then to a guy in Europe would have come down
Okay.
with the case of the rotation of the moon and stuff like that. So they've been able to measure that time-wise.
Okay.
And how fast, they know how fast the radio waves and stuff like that. So they've been doing that since, I don't know when.
Okay.
So, remember where they put them.
Okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good point. Good point. Any other comments on any of that?
But
Charlie.
you know one thing, that when I look at the moon, I look straight at it and not worry about the beam from it like I would the sun. If I looked at the sun, it'd almost blind me.
That's exactly right. You know, the again, a full moon gives us a pretty good bit of light, a lot of nights, and that's exactly right. But it's not the source of light; it's a reflection of the light. And I've used that illustration with y'all before. That's kind of how the Bible talks about us as people. We're to be the light of the world. Yet Jesus said that He is the light of the world. How's that the case? Well, again, the source of the light is not within us. We reflect that light of Jesus, and I think to me that's a good illustration, Charlie. You think of the sun being kind of a type of Christ, the moon a type of us, that we were to reflect His image to others.
Geez, I'm just glad we don't have those 5,000 mile per hour winds because we wouldn't be able to play football today. The wind in Alabama or Georgia football today.
It might could help us. We might throw a ball a long way.
If the wind was behind you, you could
Stop throwing it in.
It'd be tough throwing it into the wind. That's
if I
true.
could get out there fast enough to catch it.
When the toss, we take the wind.
That's right.
Well, that's when you give your receivers a parachute. They can-
Yeah. That's a good idea. Good idea. So here's some of the numbers, again, at these present rates, if that has been the case throughout history, if it's been moving here. So according to these formulas, again, 1,000 years, the moon would have been 125 feet closer, not much of a change. Again, if it were 1,000,000 years old, it would have been 28.4 miles closer, 10 million years, and so forth and so on. So you can see 1.4 billion years ago, some say 1.2 billion years ago, you would have the two touching. So again, it's not feasible, it's not possible at that rate that it could be that case. All right. Any other discussions on the moon before we leave that topic? I appreciate those comments. That brings us to some other things related to the earth, things that we see, different phenomenon that we see in the earth and other places too, craters and canyons. The near side of the moon is dominated by what they call maria. Impacts caused cracks in the crust. The cracks are filled with lava and it cools and hardens. And so we can see that even looking at the moon at night, it gives you little dark spots on the moon. And I was looking at it the other night and you can see how people see, back in old times, could talk about the man in the moon. I thought I could see two eyes and a nose and a mouth on the moon with those different dark spots. But it's, scientists believe that's the maria that was formed by craters that were formed and lava coming up and filling that in. There are also craters on Mars as well. We talked about the canyons on Mars that are bigger than the Grand Canyon. Both the moon and Mars show signs of geological, forgive the spelling there, activity, which both indicate relative youth for both. And of course, there are many craters on our planet. There's a 47-mile wide crater in Quebec. So again, when did those occur? When did that happen? An interesting phenomenon to me is when you look at those craters. I was reading something about this the other day. Somebody may have more of a take on this than I do. But all the crater activity on the moon is the part facing us. As the Apollo missions went around the other side of the moon and investigated, they found that those same craters were not on the far side. And the way that the moon rotates is always the same side that is facing us all the time. So it's rotating, but it's staying with us facing. So why is the other side of the moon not filled with craters? I don't know. I mean, I'm just throwing this out as an idea.
Doesn't get any sunshine.
All right, then get it. Okay, could be. Did the craters come from the earth if that's the case, if it's facing us? Could it be some of the activity of when the flood came, if you had particles and stuff that were shot out at the time of the flood. Again, I don't know. That's an interesting thing to me.
Other side made out of cheese anyhow, isn't it?
That's right.
The four-sided moves made out of cheese anyhow.
That's right.
Back to Solar Planet, and like I said, the organizations thing I'm still working on. This part may I should have had with the other part of the flood, but again, there's a lot of overlap on this. Looking at the layers of the Earth and getting into kind of the fossils and the dating of the planet is where we're headed with this next a little bit. Scientists like to talk about uniformitarianism a lot, and particularly since the 1850s, 1830s, Charles Lyell published a book on the geology of the Earth in 1830, which changed a lot of people's opinion. There's a guy named Thomas Hutton that had written a book in 1795, I think it was, that speculated the Earth is a lot older than what they had thought it was at that time, according to the Bible timeline. And then Lyell is the one that said, millions of years. And then Darwin published his book in 1859, kind of buying into what Lyell said. And so this has become prominent thinking in science since that time. So around 1850, a view began to develop which argued that slow and gradual processes with uniform rates and intensities were responsible for Earth's geologic features. And there are some things in the planet that we do see things happen at uniform rates and this sort of thing. I won't argue that. But I think we would also all agree that catastrophes have occurred throughout history, and even in our lifetime, we see that happen from time to time. Now, the flood, of course, we're doing the greatest catastrophe that the Earth has ever seen. But all of us living in our area have seen what a hurricane can do and how much catastrophe that can cause in a very short period of time. We've seen tsunamis, not here, but in other places, that completely change the landscape of various things. So while there are some processes that continue at a particular rate, don't disagree with that, there's also this idea of catastrophe that has happened over and over and over again throughout life's history. We discussed a little bit earlier about the Grand Canyon, Mount St. Helens, this sort of thing, the layers that we see. And we showed you that in Mount St. Helens, something that a lot of people saw, that we saw, many of us saw the news about the eruptions and things that went over. I think, Brother Mike, you said you had been in that area or flown over that area?
Yeah,
at one time.
86.
So again, things that people have seen, that things were laid, again, very, very quickly to get these layers that if somebody had come 1,000 years from now and didn't know about Mount St. Helens erupting, we said, oh, this happened over millions of years. So these layers can be deposited very rapidly. We've seen that happen in our lifetime, but you have strata that is formed in various areas. And this strata is sedimentary rock.
Those rock formations, there's places you can go and see like they call it a fold, I believe in it, but the rock formation will be kind of smooth. All of a sudden, it's got that great big old fold in it.
Yes.
That's smoothing.
Yes, sir.
To look at you, said, well, that had to be hot and fluid at one time.
That's exactly right.
Catastrophe time.
That's exactly right. Great point. Rocks don't bend very well, do they? Good point. So catastrophic strata formation is what we see. And again, we talked about some of this before, but this is in near Walla Walla, Washington. There are up to 40 distinct rhythmic layers exposed in Burlingame Canyon that were formed during what they call the Missoula flood. And I believe that's part of the flood of Noah's day. But you can see these floods. These are deposited very rapidly, not over thousands, not over millions of years, as they try to say. As Brother Lloyd just mentioned, you read my mind. Some of these strata that you see these unbelievable features in here. And again, rocks don't bend very well. They don't fold very well. But again, as Brother Lloyd said, it had to be hot or moving or very wet to have formed those things that we see. There's one in British Columbia, where like somebody took a paintbrush and did that to it as that occurs. That brings us to something called the geologic table. And from, I guess it's kind of been enlightening to me to go back and study this. I was really under the impression that these ages that they have, the 4.6 billion years for the Earth, the 13.7 billion for the universe, and these things, that they had some really sophisticated dating methods to do that. They must have some real important reasons for thinking that. What I found in my research is that it starts with the geologic table, the geologic column, these layers that we see. That is the main source for their dating of the world and by extension the universe and so forth. And I think there's a whole lot better explanation for that than what they give, and that being the flood of Noah's day. From what I can tell, the main evidence used to date the earth as being very old is the geologic table. However, the geologic table in textbooks does not match the evidence. Evolution must have eons of time upon which to build. The earth is alleged by science to be 4.6 billion years old. The first life form is said to have evolved over 2 billion years ago. Dinosaurs came and went over 65 million years ago, according to their scenario. We're going to hit that more at the end of our presentation in the coming weeks. Man is the newcomer, having been around the last couple of million years or so, give or take a million. What's a million or 2 years? If that is the case, there are many things in the fossil record that cannot be explained. They try to tie things together from around the world by what scientists call correlation. And correlation is defined by scientists as the end product, which is a mental abstraction called the geologic column. Limestone can be found in different layers of rock. And how do you know what the date is? You know, everybody can observe what you see. You can see these layers. You can see the fossils, but it's just a layer. It's just a fossil. The interpretation of it is the thing that kind of depends on your paradigm, your viewpoint, as to when those things occur. There should be, and I mentioned this to y'all before, there should be many deformities between these layers. If it were millions and billions of years old, you would expect to see in between the layers stumps, roots, grasses, erosion. You don't. These things were very smoothly laid, one on top of the other, without any disturbance in between. That is not what you would expect to happen. I can think of, like every day I go to I get water for our football players for our 7th period workout. And there's a little spot where I've got the water that no grass grows on it. And just a little bit of water I do, if it overflows and runs on that dirt, you see ruts being made in that little dirt there that don't have any grass on it. That's what happens when you have things like that. There should be stuff in between the layers. You don't see it. In fact, if the geologic table appeared intact anywhere in the earth, I'm told it would be 130 miles deep. And if it appeared in the textbook, you'd have the geologic table be 130 miles deep. That's not what you see. In reality, the crust of the earth is only 25 to 30 miles deep, contradicting what children are shown in science books. So the geologic table, as they draw it, will be 130 miles deep. That's 4 or 5 times bigger than the crust of earth itself. So here is their scenario, the evolutionary scenario, and I'm not an expert on this by any stretch of imagination and haven't memorized all this because I don't believe it. But here's what they say. They have the Paleozoic era, and they've got all these subdivisions here. The Cambrian, we'll talk about the Cambrian a little bit later on, but they talk about the Cambrian explosion. And this baffles scientists because below that, Precambrian, there's no life. And then all of a sudden, you see the Cambrian explosion, all of a sudden in that bottom layer, you have a lot of life. And then you get to these various other things, and as you go up the fossil record, they say that life is getting more complex and so forth. So that is their scenario on that. Millions and millions and millions of years occur to do that. So then their idea, geological uniformity, present processes have continued for billions of years. And they talk about radioisotope dating. We're going to discuss that a little bit more in a couple of weeks. So just how do you date a rock? So here's some scenarios that they have. So as they look at the various things, so they've got dates filled in, what they think when these various things have happened and gradually over over time and the various things that are in these areas. And so there's some things that they have. So the geologic column, could this be due to the flood of Noah's day? I think so. And I know that you do as well. I think it's a lot better explanation for what we see. The flood of Noah's day. If there was a global flood, as you and I believe, what would you expect to see? Well, you'd see the worldwide mountain-covering deluge would have deposited most of the world's fossil-bearing rock in a short period of time, in less than a year's time. So these layers that you're looking at are not millions and millions and millions of years, they're 1 year. Various stages of the flood. As you got waves going back and forth across the oceans. I heard one guy talking about this that said, if you had no land, think about every once in a while you have tidal waves that appear on our planet. And it's devastating when it hits the land. If there's no land, there'd be nothing to keep the tidal wave from getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So you'd have huge waves going back and forth over a period of time, putting tons of mud and debris and everything else down very quickly. If the flood made the rocks and fossils, there were no geologic ages. These would not represent 1 billion or 2 years of time, but rather 1 year of time. And that's what I believe. If the flood made the rocks and fossils, as I've said, there would be no geologic ages, as they say. So fossils, all right, as a test case. The evolutionary narrative is the fossils are the remains of animals which evolved by natural processes and were buried in watery sediments over great ages. Creation would say the fossils are the remains of animals created by God and were buried rapidly in watery sediments by Noah's flood. And I'm not going to take the time to read all this and go over this. These are things that have happened in recorded history that we know when various mountain eruptions occurred. And scientists believe that when these eruptions go, it kind of resets the clock. It's kind of how when they measure things and they're using their various dating methods, they say that it resets the clock. When they use their methods of dating, we're going to discuss this a little bit more in another week or so, but here's some of these things in some various areas. Here's a basalt spot here that they know is about 200 years old. It measures over 500,000 years. Mount Etna is 2,100 years, it measures 25 million, and so forth. You see these things, here's one that's 29 years old that measures 35 million years. And you see this all over the planet. Using the dating methods that they espouse to be accurate, we know are not accurate. These are things that have been witnessed in recorded history. Here's one 40 years old, 38 years old. Things that have been seen, and when you use their dating methods, here's the numbers that you get. Obviously, showing these dating methods don't work. Obvious that is the case. And you see those all over the place. So fossils as a burial order from the global flood. And again, so much of this is common sense. When you look at their geologic column, geologic table, this is exactly how it is. So what do you expect? So at the lowest places, you would expect to see marine life, which is exactly what you see. You expect that to get buried by the mud first, and that to be the lowest layers. That's exactly what you see. And then as you go up, you would expect the flood to cover the marshland. You'd have smaller reptiles, fish, lakes, birds, dinosaurs, large. That's exactly what you see. Fitting exactly what you would with the biblical model. Y'all bear with me as I read some of this. This was a really good presentation. Again, I stole this from a guy named Jonathan Cox, but here's some things he said that I thought were really, really good on this. The geologic column is a vertical line of many different rock formations that supposedly represents every year of history so far. It was first created by a man named James Hutton in 1795 and was later worked on more by Charles Lyell in 1830. There are supposedly 12 periods which fit into 4 eras in the geologic column. We showed you those just a minute ago, Precambrian, etc. Supporters of the geologic column in evolution say that each period has creatures that are slowly evolving into what we have today. The creatures eventually die and rot away or they become fossils. The way they, I want you to catch on to this phrase right here. I think this is really, really important in showing a big error that they make in their assumptions. The way they identify each layer of rock is by what fossils are in it. All right, so think about that. So the layer of rock, how do you date how old the layer is? You look at what fossils are in it. How do they date the fossils? Is it radioisometric dating? Is it carbon-14 dating? No, that's not how they do it. So they date the layers by what fossils are in it, and in that way they determine the ages of each fossil. They must assume that they will find only certain fossils in a certain rock layer. But that's not always the case. There's one problem with that. They found fossils in a layer with other fossils from 140 million years earlier, supposedly in the same layer. Also, the 12 layers that make up the geologic column are identified as a certain layer by the fossils that are in them. Most fossils are dated by the rocks they are in, and then they use the fossils to date the rocks. Y'all follow what we're saying here? Whereas they say the layers, they tell how old the layers are by the fossils that are in it. They date the fossils by the rock layer that it's in. Circular reasoning is not tied to anything. But that's how they come up with the dates. I used to think it was through the carbon-14 stuff. That's not how they do it. This is how they do it. This is how they come up with these dates. So again, I'll just mention that. The layers of rock are dated by the fossils in it. The fossils are dated by the rocks. It is circular reasoning that they're using. R.H. Wastall from Cambridge, who's not a creationist, admitted it cannot be denied that geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the organisms that they contain. Isn't there a better way to do this? Charlie, did I see your hand up a minute ago?
I think I even talk about the rocks. But if you're standing on solid rock, you won't be moved.
That's good. That's a great point, Charlie. That's exactly right. So Mr. Cox goes on and says, these are problems for them, and the only way they have dealt with these problems that I know of is by ignoring them. And that's sad. And as I said before, it's sad to me that kids are taught in some high schools and in all colleges, all public colleges, that this is the way that it is. The professor is so confident talking before them, and they're never told where these things really come from, these ideas. According to scientists, all of the above periods should have a layer of rock formation. This means there should be a large number of layers, since according to the geologic column, the Earth is 4,600,000,000 years old. Unfortunately, for those who believe in the geologic column, we have not found that many layers so far. First off, the entire geologic column is supposed to be around 100 to 200 miles thick, which will represent the total sedimentary activity of all geologic ages. And again, sedimentary rock, we mentioned that a few weeks ago, is rock that is laid by water. So it's laid down by water, hardens over time. But the average thickness of most columns around the world is 1 mile, and in some places it gets up to 16 miles, but not very often. This tells us that scientists created the geologic column using information from many sites with only part of the geologic column. Proponents of the geologic column who know that it may be missing layers will say that the reason we find only parts of the geologic column and not all of it is because of erosion. Each period of the geologic column has its own rock deposit, and they are saying that when the rock deposit happens, water comes and erosion happens. Once the water removes the layer that was there, the next layer is laid down where the other was. This is one of the reasons for not being able to find the geologic column everywhere. Now, we agree that erosion occurred. That's what we see in the Grand Canyon and places like that. The layers laid real quick. When you have water that has been held back by some obstruction, breaks through, makes the canyon very quickly.
That water's about like their asteroid. It just magically eroded a whole layer and then put another one down.
It's amazing how those things happen.
Yeah.
The guy who invented the geologic column admits that it does not exist. It cannot be found anywhere in a real observable location. You can only find it in textbooks. And again, kids are taught that this is the way it is. You can only find these things hypothetically. The entire complete geologic column is found in books which require a cliff hundreds of miles high, as we said. The complete column is found nowhere on the planet, and even textbooks, some textbooks will admit that. The geologic column also is supposed to be everywhere, since it represents the entire timeline for the Earth. But it does not appear all over the Earth. In fact, even if it did appear in 50 different locations, that's still only 1% of the Earth. If you have the ocean floor, that number drops to 0.4% of the places where the geologic column could be. And here's a PhD that said this: 80 to 85% of Earth's land surface does not have even 3 geologic periods appearing in correct consecutive order. It becomes an overall exercise of gargantuan special pleading and imagination for the evolutionary uniformitarian paradigm to maintain that there ever were geologic periods. One of the locations that should have at least most of the geologic column is the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is one of the deepest land exposures there is, and it contains less than half of the ideal geologic column. If this is one of the largest land openings, then why is it less than half of the geologic column that is contained there? With all the problems with the geologic column, why should you and I believe that this is even a thing? All right, sedimentary rock. There's an average of 1.5 miles of sedimentary rock covering the continents at present. Billions and billions of dead things are found throughout the world in rocks laid down by water. Think about that for just a minute. Billions and billions of dead things are found in rock that was laid down by water.
Well, Coach, correct me if I'm wrong, but to make a fossil out of a living thing, it has to be covered quickly?
It has to be covered quickly.
Because otherwise it decomposes itself.
Our scavenger's going to take it, and
So,
absolutely.
Billions of years for it to get covered. Do you think in that time frame it would have just decomposed and there would have been nothing there to fossilize?
Yes. Amen, Brother Dallas. There's no doubt about it. The evidence points, all the evidence points to quick and rapid burial. It's like we talked about the polystrate fossils, the trees going through these layers of rock. There's no, even common sense would tell you, it got buried very quickly for that to be the case. I agree. Yes, Charlie.
Well, according to the Bible, it talks about, on this rock I will build my church.
That's a great example, Charlie. That's right. A great parallel to what we're talking about. All right, so the evidence for slow and gradual deposits is just not there. Nothing about a rock tells you how old it is. Its layers of dried out mud. It was originally wet mud that was laid down. There's virtually no soil erosion between the layers, as we mentioned a minute ago. Unprotected soil, as you and I know, erodes very quickly. You would expect to see bioturbation in and between layers. You do not. And that's a fancy word which I didn't know until I was doing all this, so don't want y'all think I knew all this stuff because I didn't. But it's defined as the reworking of soils and sediments by animals or plants. It includes burrowing, ingestion, defecation of sediment grains. But the point is, you don't see it between the layers. You should, if it's millions and billions of years old. Sediment on Earth will give you a maximum age of 15 million years, not billions of years. Not saying the Earth is 15 million years old, but that would be a max that it could be. The Cambrian layers were various stages of the flood. I believe that firmly. Sediments in water self-sort themselves by density and coarseness. So people talk about there's some sorting in the fossil record. There is, but if it's a whole lot more with the flood paradigm than with what they say. The layers are not representative of yearly deposits. Multitudes of layers can be deposited in a year. Now this was something I ran across just a few years ago in somebody's study in the world history class. A guy named Nicholas Steno is considered to be the father of stratigraphy. Now that sounds real fancy, but stratigraphy is just the study of the rock layers. And so he was the one that began this, and he wrote a book in 1669. Long before Thomas Hutton, long before Charles Lyell, long before Charles Darwin, when scientists believed in the Bible. So he was a Bible believer. I want you to notice a few things about him. The flood destroys the concept of the geologic column, in my opinion. Nicholas Steno, the founder of the study of stratigraphy, he developed the rules that people that study this branch of science, stratigraphy study. He's one that developed these things. So he's the developer of the basic rules of the study of the rock layers. He felt that the flood caused these layers. Matter of fact, Steno's 1669 book, and I saw a copy online. There was a copy of the front page of this thing. But it was dedicated, this is how it was worded, dedicated to the proof of the Noachian deluge. The guy who invented the study of stratigraphy believed that these layers were created by the flood. The one that came up with the 12 rules in this thing that they still used believed the flood was the cause of these things. Steno believed in a universal flood throughout his entire life. That was the understanding of the man who knew enough to develop the rules of stratigraphy that one must know to pass the course. He was a pioneer who also happened to be a genius. Two authors of a book called Evolution of the Earth, who again are not creationists, said this. They wrote, besides correctly interpreting fossils, the result of Nicholas Steno's work was formulation of the most basic principles for analysis of Earth history. Steno showed great insight. Steno's 12 axioms provide the ultimate basis for practically all interpretation of Earth history, so their importance can hardly be overemphasized. So here's two evolutionists that praise Steno's work. They're saying that's the exact pattern that we use to understand things. They never said in this science book, or whatever book they're writing, that Steno believed in the flood.
Well, the problem is, if he believed in the flood, all those rules are based on the flood happening.
Yes.
So if you throw out the flood happening, all the rules go.
They don't work. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. An evolutionist named John C. McCampbell, head of the Department of Geology of southeastern Louisiana, admitted that the facts of geology would fit with a biblical worldview. So you might have. So he said that he admitted that you could fit this with the Bible narrative. The biblical flood presents a strong case and presents a serious challenge to modern scientific views.
Anything that comes out of Southeastern University, out of Louisiana, only me. Anybody?
Rock layers record a sequence of events. These layers are formed in water and points to the flood. The lack of ability for geologists to interpret the flood has led to all of the confusion and misunderstanding of what we see in the rock layers. And a quote I read by an individual, a naturalist cannot interpret a world with a supernatural history. And that's the problem they have. They're trying to interpret it and rule out the flood, and they cannot come up with the correct answers. The principle of lateral continuity of strata states that layers of sediment initially extend laterally in all directions. In other words, they're laterally continuous. In other words, that's saying that big deposits of sediment will spread out in a uniform way until it runs out of sediment or whatever. So as a result, rocks that are otherwise similar but are now separated by a valley or other erosional feature can be assumed to originally have been connected or the same. And so there's a picture of Nicholas Steno and lateral continuity, originally extending in all directions until thinned or terminated. And a quote from him, material forming any stratum were continuous over the surface of the earth unless some of the solid bodies stood in the way. And so, again, he believed that the flood had put these layers down and that later things could have eroded or caused the valleys and so forth that we see. Now, something called turbidites. This was sandstone deposits resulting from turbidity current underwater landslides, which carry particles of widely different sizes. Fancy language that I don't completely understand myself. But basically, it's things that are not only laid by water, but it's actually laid while underwater. And most of the things that we see, there's a case. Not only were they laid in water or by water, they were laid under the water.
Well, Coach, to do that, just take a Coke bottle, pour some dirt in it, shake it up, and what's all still suspended is your turbidity. So that and it all settles out at a different rate. Some of the clays will never settle unless you put something in there to make them.
Very good, very interesting, very interesting. Thank you for that. So the characteristics, you see graded bedding, coarse particles on the bottom, finer particles on top. I guess kind of what you're saying, that is kind of
Yeah, the sands and everything else heavy will settle nearly immediately, but your silts and your clays, like we have some clays down here, unless you put a flocculant in there, which is another chemical attached to the clay particle, it'll never settle out of the water column. It'll just stay suspended in it.
Interesting, interesting. So you have many thin layers around the world. Here's a picture of something showing turbidity. This is, again, a lot of sediment that is underwater in this particular picture. You see widespread fossilization, T-Peats sandstone here in the Grand Canyon. See a layer here toward the top of that. About 30% of all sedimentary rocks in the Grand Canyon are turbidites. Again, rocks not only laid by water, but laid while underwater. Again, pointing to the truth of the flood model. Widespread fossil layers. So you see this type of sandstone that's in the Grand Canyon. This showing all the areas where you see similar sandstone in North America. How did sandstone near the Grand Canyon, how does it appear in this part of Canada and these regions right here? Again, if it was a flood, you could understand that. That would make sense. Again, the evolutionary model, to me, would be hard to explain these things. Some geologists suggest that 50% of the world's sedimentary rocks might be turbidites. Again, sediment not just deposited by water, but while underwater, as much as 50%. And again, these aren't creationists that are saying this, they're geologists, but it fits exactly with what we would expect with the flood model. Now, talking about circular reasoning, the bell's going to catch before we get to this, but we mentioned a moment ago about the, I mean, it is humorous. If it wasn't so sad, it would be humorous. That again, they date the layers by the fossils in it, they date the fossils by the layers that they're in. Circular reasoning. So say, what is circular reasoning? And there's some stuff I found on the internet, and I tried to find some examples, not just a circular reasoning, but just kind of logic that doesn't make sense. Circular reasoning is a type of argument in which the conclusion comes back to the premise without providing any outside proof. There's nothing to connect it to anything else, meaning both sides of the argument are making the same point. But using its own conclusion as a premise, the statement doesn't offer any type of proof. Instead, it declares the conclusion in another form, consequently asking the listener to accept it as being true without any outside evidential claims. It often comes in a form that looks like this. Premise A. Claim A is true because claim B is true. So again, both are assumptions. And so, again, claim B is true because claim A is true, type of thing. Fooling someone with circular reasoning would require correctly assuming that they already believe that your conclusion is true. So you already believe a conclusion, and because you already believe this, then evolution is full of this. Evolution is full of this type of reasoning.
And then they turn right around and say claim B is true because claim A is true.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes. So I want to share with just a few examples, and I found some of these online, and if y'all come up with some better examples than these, I wasn't completely satisfied with all of them that I found, but just share a few things with you. So, as we've been talking about, we know how old a fossil is by the rock layer in which it is located. We know how old the rock layers are by the fossils that are contained in the layer. That's circular reasoning. There's nothing to tie that to anything to have any idea how old either one is. Women should have access to abortion services, so abortion should be legal and unavailable. Here's somebody's belief, so because they believe that, then they say that should be the case. Most people get a college degree because getting a degree is the norm. It's the norm to get a degree because most people go to college. What's wrong with getting a degree? I'm not saying that's the case, but again, the logic there, just because everybody does it.
Sounds like Kamala and Jean Pierre talking there. Talking in circles.
Yes. We'll get some of these others next week, but I appreciate your good attention and appreciate y'all humoring me and listening to this material.
At least Kamala would